Ladies and gentlemen, please remain seated. The next session is about to start. الحضور الكريم، يرجى البقاء في مقاعدكم. ستبدأ الجلسة التالية بعد قليل. Ladies and gentlemen, please remain seated. The next session is about to start. السيدات والسادة، تبدأ الآن جلسة حوارية بعنوان هل تحققت توقعات الماضي؟ تديرها دكتور كريستين ألفورد، مدير متحف الاكتشاف في جامعة جنوب أستراليا. Dear guests, starting now. A panel discussion titled The Future Past: How do visions of the future shape our tomorrow? Moderated by Dr. Kristin Alford, Director of Museum of Discovery, University of South Australia.
Well, welcome everyone. It's a great pleasure to be here for this panel, The Future Past: How do visions of the future shape our tomorrow? My name is Kristin Alford. I'm a futurist and the Director of MOD at the University of South Australia. I'm joined here by Dr. Milbourne, who is Acting Head of Knowledge Production and Senior Curator at the National Museum of African Art, Smithsonian Institution in Washington, DC. Dr. Tom Marks, a writer, art critic and co-founder of Marks Calil, a cultural consultancy that provides strategic advice to international museums and art businesses. And finally, Brenda McGetrick, who's the creative director of the Museum of the Future and an internationally renowned writer, creator and designer. Please join me in welcoming the panel. What we want to talk about is how culture shapes the future. I've been doing a project recently with an Aboriginal researcher and colleague of mine, Dr. Gilda Andrews, and we've been looking at the toolkit that we use for futures methodologies and saying what's missing when we want to think about not just Western approaches, but also First Nations approaches in the Australian context. What's missing from the futures toolkit? And what Gilda's taught me is that there is one really strong thing missing when we start futures, and that's often that we other the future. It doesn't exist in our space. We don't see it as us being in it. It's removed. And so one of those first really important questions to ask from a two-way minded perspective is, where are you and who are you with? Who's having the conversation? So we've got this amazing panel and we're with you all here at the Museum of the Future, and I'd just like to again thank the Dubai Future Forum for welcoming us to have these conversations over this space. And I also just wanted to mention something from a previous panel. It was the panel about heritage futures. And Rashid bin Shahib, who was moderating that panel, talked very eloquently about the contribution of this museum to shape how its citizens might think about the future. And he just made some comment about the fact that it is clad in poetry. These words are cultural trajectories. And I think that first question, where are we and who are we with that in mind, is a really, really great way to start the panel. The second thing I wanted to say was the stories we tell shape our beliefs. One of my colleagues at the University of South Australia, Professor Marnie Hughes-Warrington, has just published a book with Routledge looking at how people perceive histories. And interestingly, most people understand and know about history from film, from TV, from online streaming. So I think Horrible Histories has a lot to be responsible for. That's how most people perceive histories. But also that's how a lot of us perceive futures. That's how we understand what it might be like to live on Mars. for instance. You know, if we think about the word robot, it first came from a Czech play, and it was a story about a slave. If you've been to the mezzanine level 2 with that humanoid robot there, you'll understand that a lot of the way we perceive robots is through casting them as women. A lot of our AI, you know, voice aids are cast as women because that's how our beliefs and our stories have been structured. And there are a bunch of artists and speculative designers who are thinking about how we might think about the future through their art. There was a really great panel yesterday with Rahid and Macy talking about felt futures and how we might feel the future through art and how that comes about. But I think what we want to talk about today is that that's not just a present moment of anticipating some kind of future in the distance. And in fact, artists have always thought about how their futures might be perceived, often thought about how they might be perceived. And so I wanted to start by handing across to you, Karen. So in your role, you're looking after collections and creating exhibitions with works of art. And museums have always told stories about who we were and who we might want to be. So I wanted to see if you could share a few of those examples from the context that you're working in at the National Museum of African Art.
Thank you. Thank you all so much for being here today. And I am trying to move into the slides.
Back.
So,
perfect.
Oh, there we go. Thank you. Thank you for your patience with that. I work actually primarily with global contemporary artists, and part of the reason I do that is trying to think about ways of creating platforms collaboratively and allowing artists the space to take new visions in the direction that they wish to do that. But I intentionally picked this work of art from 1898 to allow us to sort of have a moment to think about the lens that we bring to looking at the past and how we imagine futures in the past. And in particular, this work of art was carved by an artist by the name of Lubosi Liwenika. He was the king of Barotseland from 1878 to 1916. He placed this work of art in the hands of a Swiss entrepreneur in 1898, and it became an ambassador for his nation internationally. It is one of multiple works of art that he placed in museums. He is an artist who not only had an atelier at his court, was selling works of art at the expatriate hub of Victoria Falls. He also traveled to Great Britain, where he was the only world leader accorded the title of king alongside Edward VII in 1902, and had an exhibition at Taunton Castle. So this work of art is made at a moment by a leader who 10 years earlier had been ousted from his throne, who 10 years earlier had a kingdom that was not recognized internally, much less externally, and by 1905 becomes a kingdom for which the King of Italy was negotiating for its borders between Britain and Portugal, and it was never established as a colony but maintained protectorate status under Great Britain. So what you are seeing is a work of art that was deployed by an artist intentionally to envision the future that he wanted for his kingdom. He works with the emblem of the elephant because that is the emblem of state. And we can think about elephants as enormous. They are the mightiest of beasts, but because of their visibility, they are also the most vulnerable. He was tapping into all of that and sending this work of art out into the world. And then the second image I wanted to speak to is really about what it means when artworks are sent out into the world and how we then receive them and create museums around them. So the image that you see on your left is the original Museum of African Art before it actually became part of the Smithsonian. It was conceived in 1963, and for many of you, that won't be as important a year, but this was the height of the civil rights movement in the United States. It was the same year that 4 little girls were murdered when the 16th Street Baptist Church was bombed in Birmingham, and the founding director returned to the United States from having been part of the Foreign Service in Germany and recognized that despite the incredible efforts of historically black colleges and universities, there wasn't enough conversation about the accomplishments of Africans and African artists, and so he set out to redress that by creating a museum. He opened the museum in the former home of the legendary diplomat and formerly enslaved legislator Frederick Douglass. So he intentionally chose a space that would be a site for cross-cultural understanding. That was its goal, and then it moved on to the Smithsonian on the National Mall, where it's joined with the Asian Art Museum to be part of an international complex. But I am a month away from leaving the Smithsonian to actually move to a new museum. I'm going to become the director of the Fralin Art Museum at the University of Virginia, where I'm being given the opportunity to build a new museum. And I chose this photograph on the right to emphasize the fact that museums are not walls. That is one of the most common mistakes that we make. Museums are spaces for encounters. And in trying to think about a new museum for the future, that will represent arts. The idea of this museum or this art center is how does it combine across media? So we're combining with a performing arts center. And how do we center underrepresented voices within that space? How do we create flexibility in it instead of predetermine what the future can possibly be based on where the walls are, based on how the space is conceived, based on so many different concerns? For instance, I'll give one example before turning it over to you to talk about artists. How do we build a space where we know that communities can come in and burn in Pepe, or have feasts with the ancestors without setting off the sprinkler system and destroying the whole of the museum? How do you think about that in anticipation of what a museum can be, instead of always trying to retrofit? So.
Yes, that resonates every time we want to do a smoking ceremony with a Welcome to Country, where at MOD, where I am, we have to go down to the river, which is also a beautiful place to be. It smells like eucalypts and you're in nature, but otherwise we do set off the sprinkler system. And I think that's a really interesting point to bring up around how museums are also changing to enable people to start to think about the future in those spaces which are traditionally historical kind of entities. So I know that there's quite a few people from the Future Oriented Museums Network in the audience, museums that are deliberately using their collections or their installations or their artworks to build future's capability in communities, which is exactly as you're describing. So we might come back to that in a minute as well.
And if I may, one thing I forgot to say about Leonika that I just want to emphasize is that when we bring a particular lens to looking at the past, when we anticipate something is traditional rather than looking at the agency of that moment, we limit the kinds of stories that we can tell in these new spaces. And I think it's really important to highlight the agency and to look at the particularities of each context.
Yeah, no, thank you. So we would like to pass it across to you, Tom, to start talking about the artists in that space that Karen's just mentioned.
And I think what Karen has said about how far objects or artworks might be maps, provisional maps that are evolving into the future, is something that is really relevant, certainly for my second example, and perhaps something we will come back for, temporal maps as much as anything. Yeah. The first example I've chosen, I want to talk about two examples that really, I think, press the kind of radical capacity of the imagination to think or provoke the future. The first one, I felt I had to choose the Futurist Cookbook, because what is a gathering of futurists without a Futurist Cookbook? The Futurist Cookbook was published as a provocation in 1932 by F.T. Marinetti, a second wave of the Italian Futurist movement, seeking to align cultural production, art, architecture with technological progress and the experience of technological progress, the sights, sounds, the sensory experiences of the new world. It's a very problematic text. It's militaristic. It has a proximity to Italian fascism. It has a misogyny to it and an exclusionary nationalism. But it also has certain types of value that might help us think about ways of imagining the future and ways artists have imagined the future. Very quickly, the sort of chief provocation that became a cause célèbre in the 1930s was that pasta in Italy was to be abolished. which led to articles around the world. A headline in the Chicago Tribune, Italians made down spaghetti. This sort of, this terror of trying to move towards, I mean, Marinetti saw spaghetti as sluggish, slow, heavy, and the qualities of the food he associated with a national temperament that he wanted to re-engage. Indeed, that focus on the sensory, the tactile, one of the images we have here, the central image, is aerotactile food, which was meant to be, sorry, not in the center. One of the famous images is of a type of food that was to be eaten with swatches of silk and velvet alongside it, eating a bulb of fennel while stroking a piece of velvet, while perfumes are piped into the room while you're eating, to imagine this kind of new intensified experience of modernity. In fact, the central image is something else I want to just quickly talk about, which shows you it's supposed to be a tennis cutlet. It's a veal cutlet. The handle is made of an anchovy with a slice of banana on the top of it. But one of the things that shows you in some ways is how Marinetti was thinking about some of the genres of the future. In fact, this whole cookbook is not so much a typical cookbook as a type of collage, of manifesto, of article, of fantasy, of short story, and of recipe. And I wonder whether that's one way we might think about types of things the artists bring to the future, types of medium or genre. Another thing that it really does is it's a very comic, it's very ludic. And one of the things that I've heard a lot about in the last 2 days, notwithstanding we heard the last panel was hilarious, but we were stuck in the green room, not able to listen to it, is a model of quite an earnest future. And I'd really be interested to kind of just set that provocation of what is the role of comedy in the future? What is the role of tragedy in the future? What are the role of genres and the emotions we associate with them, of joy, grief, happiness, and sadness? What versions of them might we have or model in the future? I'm going to move just quickly onto the second example, if I can work out which button I press.
Big fat green one.
Which is, I wanted to just pull into the discussion a work by Hilma af Klint, one of the great visionary artists of the early 20th century. Hilma af Klint was a visionary Swedish painter, little known in her lifetime. She was motivated by communication as she saw it with the spirit world. She espoused the type of syncretic mysticism that she thought was producing visions that were attuned towards a possible future. Wouldn't be seen. What she's become, specifically in an exhibition at the Guggenheim in 2019, which was called Painting for the Future, is the poster child of a new turn in museology, in curation, in the history of modernism, towards visionary art, towards artists who rejected or perhaps leavened their rationalism with versions of visionary thinking, with knowledge of spiritualism, of theosophy, of other types of mystical systems. Most of these works were made by women who were peripheral to the mainstream of the dominant narrative of modern art. But one of the things that has happened, the Guggenheim show has 600,000 visitors. It became in 2019 for an artist who was scarcely known until 10 years ago when there was an exhibition in Stockholm. It became the most visited exhibition ever at the Guggenheim in New York. This has been accompanied by numerous other exhibitions on the Transcendental Painting School, on Georgiana Houghton, and so on and so forth. So a real turn towards the visionary. I just want to point out modes of esoteric, occult thinking, sure, but those are also ways of thinking that engage with types of sympathy, models of empathy, with models for the ecology, with thoughts about collectivism. After all, if you believe you're communing with spirits, you have a different idea of the self and the borders of the self than you would have if you have a heroic mode of artistry. So I think I'll kind of leave it there and pass on to Brendan, this kind of fluidity and the ability for this artist in particular and the artist she represents to break down borders and still to keep doing so in museums today.
No, thanks, Tom. Karen, did you just want to say something?
Just a quick comment that before we move away from the arts, I mean, one of the things that really struck me listening to you is for all of us to bear in mind the fact that every work of art is contemporary at the time that it is made. And you have to imagine that artists present in order to imagine what the future was that they were trying to anticipate. And among the actionable items that really comes through in the way that you talk or about what you've spoken is the active process of erasure and forgetting. So we have to choose not only what we remember, but also what we forget, and that's what really comes to the fore with some of these stories that we don't know or that are emerging more recently.
Yeah, no, thank you. And that, I mean, I know a lot of us, I've just done a series of workshops where I'm using Sahel's Futures Triangle regularly, and what you've just said, I think, really sums up those big questions around the weight of the past. What do we purposely retain and bring forward because it's something of value, and what do we discard because it no longer serves us? And the conversation I had with Nancy earlier, wherever Nancy is, was also around, how do we remake what we interpreted the past and reuse it in a way that becomes useful for us. I'm also really stuck on the idea coming from an Australia that seems to be kind of steeped in conservatism, especially around First Nations recognition, is that maybe that's because we're just all still eating meat and potatoes and we're sluggish and we lack imagination because of our diets. I cannot get over that this afternoon. It's really sticking with me. So thanks for sticking that one in my head. But I think there is probably a thread there around, diet and changing diet, and when we're thinking about sort of, especially things around climate justice and the changing world that we've got. And I think you mentioned, Tom, this idea around collectivism and ecology. I think it's worth thinking about how we're moving to thinking about that more generally.
If I can just say one more quick thing, which is that although I wouldn't wish anyone to want to be Marinetti or to become him, one of the things that he does model in a way is a kind of futures, and I think that's something else we haven't heard. What is the role of dissent in the future, and how far might that be carried out by people who have creative practices?
Yeah, no, great. Brendan, I might pass on to you because I think there are representations of that collectivism and ecology that kind of sit within the museum that I'd like to hear a bit more about.
Sure. Hi, everyone. I'm going to show a piece from the museum. I will express on behalf of everyone at the museum, I express our collective regret that so many of you don't actually get to experience all the exhibitions, but I'll show you one piece. So this is called The Forest. It's on level 4, the Heal Institute. There's a lot to say about it. What I'll say just in the briefest sense is what it is essentially a kind of mixed reality experience, a multi-sensory, multimedia experience of a rainforest. So basically, it's a kind of based on a digital model of a small part of the Amazon. And I'll just say, maybe to kind of zoom out 1 second before I actually explain the piece. One of the things I think that art can and should do, and I think that this, I heard this repeatedly in some of the really excellent panels that I was able to see, is kind of apply a certain pressure to thinking about emerging technologies, thinking about emerging policies, thinking about emerging trends of all kinds. And I think, for example, the notion of a digital model, the notion of a digital twin is really central to thinking about smart cities and smart services and all these kinds of things, which, as you can imagine, in a forward-thinking, forward-moving, forward-acting city like Dubai, and in a forward-moving, hopefully forward-thinking institution like the Museum of the Future, you are kind of confronted with incredible quantities of charlatans and con men who come and try to sell you a dream about smart cities and about all these things. And I think one of the key things that art can do and that the museum tries to do is look at these things, look at something like a digital model with sympathy and try to identify within it the beautiful idea and say, and focus on what could be done with this beautiful idea. What can be done that, McKinsey would not advise you to do. And so, for example, this piece is taking the notion of a digital model, which is common in the world of architecture, in the world of urban planning, et cetera, and it's applying it to the natural world. And so the idea is, in the context of climate change, in the context of ecosystem collapse, mass extinction, what if we were able to create digital models of the natural world that were able to capture the intricacy and the complexity of an ecosystem? Was created by Marshmallow Laser Feast, who are a studio in London. And basically what they did is they traveled to the Amazon. They found a single kind of moment, which is this tree, ceiba tree, and then all of the sort of community of species that coexist with it and under it and around it and inside it. And then they captured this to the highest level of fidelity that they possibly could. So they used LiDAR scanning, photogrammetry, scent sampling, sound sampling, et cetera. And they created, to the extent that within our limited tools we can, they created the raw material for a digital model of not only the tree, but this sort of full interwoven community of species that exists with the tree and help the tree to exist and that it helps to exist. And applied sort of what's interesting about digital modeling, which is that you can reveal not only what something is, but what's happening below the surface. You can show connections. You can reveal things like, nitrogen molecules or hydrogen molecules or the distribution of water through a root system and these kinds of things. And so basically, within the context of the museum, that's what this thing is suggesting, is that in the future, could we do this? Could we understand the natural world with the level of care and intensity that we now apply to the human-made world? And I think in terms of like art and as it relates to the past, it's a really profound insight because in the end, the past, there's a lot more of the past that didn't include us than has included us. So to the extent that we want to improve or deepen our relationship to the natural world, that's a matter of improving and deepening our relationship with the past, because all of the beings that we coexist with on the planet have been here a lot longer than us. And so if we are to move into a future in which we're not applying technology, applying our sort of best ideas and our most ambitious plans to kind of mastering the natural world and kind of bending it to our will, and instead we're adopting a point of view that's kind of humble and understands that we need to be able to actually live with it healthily, how do we then apply these emerging technologies and these kind of deep potentials toward that kind of impulse? So that's basically what this work does. But I'll just say one other point about it. So that's kind of what it does in the raw sense, and you could imagine that could be like a metaverse work, or you could VR work. You could experience that in a lot of different ways. But one of the things that I really was genuinely touched by in the panels that I sat in is how much emphasis there was on embodiment and multisensory experience and locating an experience as it relates to a person existing on the planet Earth, not existing in a virtual space. So this piece has similar qualities. As you experience it, it's a mixed reality experience, so sound is very important. There's sort of spatial audio, 20 channels of a soundscape, which is based on field recordings from the Amazon. There's also a scent that we made, which is sort of attempting as much as it possibly can to recreate the scent of the Amazon, which was a really interesting and torturous experience. You can imagine during COVID, doing that remotely is not fun. but it was really essential to it because part of what we're trying to do is communicate new ways of getting people to relate to the natural world in new ways. And one way is through the language of game engines and video games. Another is through sound and truly immersive spatial sound, and another is through sound. So the last thing I'll say is one other component of the same floor. Yeah, which is this. So basically, this is a quote from a 17th century scholar in China. Ancestors plant the trees, descendants enjoy the shade. There's an equivalent of it in many cultures. There's one that is sort of questionable attribution that says a society grows rich when old men plant trees that they know that they'll never sit under. I take a lot of inspiration from that no longer present slide because that's actually the point that I'm making. It's all ephemeral and we're all,
Yeah. Thank you.
So, no, but my point is just to quickly conclude, because I'd rather have the conversation, is, within the context of this forum, I really have felt very deeply for a lot of the futurists who kind of are trying to advocate for positive, ambitious thinking about the future in a context where I think a lot of people are like, are you stupid? Everything's getting worse. Like, what's wrong with you? Mm-hmm. But I really think that ideas like this, where you're kind of understanding yourself, as a kind of link in a chain, but also understanding yourself really with an obligation, or let's say an opportunity to serve, not yourself and not even necessarily people around you, but people who truly are defenseless because they're not here yet. And I think there's something beautiful about that, and I think that a lot of what we have tried to do in the museum, and certainly a lot of what I've heard advocated for in this forum, is coming from that perspective.
Yeah, I mean, I think, as I said, the title of this panel is Thinking About the Future Past, and I think all of you have really pulled out these sort of different aspects of time and allowed us to be sort of really shifting in our space around time, and it sort of unpicks the linearity of the future just being from now to something, and we're able to shift. We've got an exhibition that we're putting in Mod to open in January called Broken, which it recognises exactly what you've said, that most of our visitors feel like there are a lot of things about the future that feel threatening. And we're trying to prompt alternatives for them to imagine different things. And one of the things that we're imagining is, what if we did democracy differently? And we're putting in a series of time commissioners who will comment on policy. So we've got the Commissioner for Urgency, who is talking about right now, the Commissioner for the Senate, which is talking about 6 years in the Australian context, that covers the change of government, the Commissioner for Children, thinking about the next 20 years, the Commissioner for Generations, thinking about Elise Boulding's 200-year present, where you can imagine your grandmother and your granddaughter. And then the Commissioner for Deep Time, which again in the Australian context is thinking about the last 60,000 years of continuing culture and the next 60,000 years of continuing culture. And all of those timescales then bring a different question to the sort of policy that you're undertaking, and gives some flexibility. And I think actually all of you have played with concepts that allow us to move, I'm thinking futures cone, to the preposterous, to kind of unpicking the assumptions that we have about what the future might be, whether beautiful example of mixing technology and environment and kind of breaking down those knowledge systems. So I just thought we would finish, if I could just ask you each to comment on the power of being able to play with those assumptions and being able to unpick some of those really big concepts like power, time, where change happens. So Karen, we might start with you.
Thank you. It's a wonderful question, and I think actually one of the takeaways for me really is the fact that time does not have to be seen as progressive. And I think that that's one of the inherent challenges that many of us face in a context such as this, where we're all thinking forward as if it's straight steps. And that's one of the reasons I mentioned erasure, but I also want to talk about other concepts of time. And I'm going to give an example that's Congo, so from Central Africa. And because I'm a visual person, you often see it visualized as a diamond or as a cross with circles at each point. And it's called the 4 moments of the sun, or the Dikenga. And so just as the sun rises, reaches noon, to set, to fall into night, so to be rise again in the next day, so too the soul is born, we flourish, we become elders, we become ancestors so that the next generation might be born. That time is not inherently progressive, and that's part of what's so important in recognizing erasure. We have to choose what we forget, because otherwise we're going to return to the same cycles, or we can choose what we wish to build upon. It is a cyclical process.
Thank you.
It's
Tom.
funny, I spoke a bit about genres, like literary critic before, but obviously a lot of the visions of the future that have taken narrative forms have been catastrophic, because fundamentally to move in H.G. Wells or other people who have written the future, you have to move into disaster from one place to another. That is the kind of linear model of thinking about the future. It's not so engaging to think of a kind of perfect present. And we've been talking about images of the future. Images are static. We have to think about how we move through those things. I just wanted to use my kind of last couple of minutes to draw out this idea that artists should somehow be central to how we conceive of, imagine the future. In a survey that the Straits Times in Singapore I imagine, or I hope, that nobody in this room could picture a future that didn't have any artists in it. And then thinking about what place those artists have in those versions of the future that you start to model. If you're working on cities, where the spaces are for artists, where artists' roles are in governance, in strategy. Certainly in the culture sector, artists are being centered far more in governance strategies, in comms opportunities, in programming, in curatorial. There is a feeling in which those modes of intelligence that many artists espouse, and they are, of course, diverse modes of intelligence, need to be put right at the forefront of how we move towards the future.
I think, Brendan, you and I had talked about sort of diverse modes of intelligence in the work that you're presenting and drawing on a number of different knowledges.
Yeah, I have mixed feelings about it, because on the one hand, of course, I think that artists and art in general should have a place of prominence in decision-making or in conversations about it. But I also think that the art at its most valuable is about applying pressure to the system that as it currently exists, basically. So the second that you go like, okay, I'm going to add some art type thinking to this basically indifferent to art ideology, you're not necessarily doing what art, you're not contributing what art can do most successfully, because really, in the end, any society where you go art is, or not any society, but let's say any way of thinking that concludes that art is irrelevant and is not contributing, has within it some systemic problems, I would say. And exposing those systemic problems is kind of what art should be doing, as opposed to like getting in through the back door and trying to make modest contributions to sort of pretty it up. So I don't know, it's a challenging thing, because I'm certainly very familiar with that mentality. That's kind of like, if you can't quantify it, it's worthless. If it's inefficient, it's worthless. If it makes me feel weird, it's bad. You know, I know all of those things.
But isn't there something about the recklessness and restlessness combined that many artists can bring into, and the breathing space that comes with that can be a kind of opportunity to facilitate different types of discussion about the future or about policy?
Inshallah. No, I hope so. I'm not going to say that yes, because I think there's many examples of that not happening, but anyway.
Yeah, I mean, and what I'm hearing is a bunch of futurists going, yes, that's what we do, right? we make people uncomfortable, we shouldn't be challenging spaces, we shouldn't be necessarily accepting used futures and just nibbling at the edge. We should be thinking about wholesale system change. And so, you know, I think the panels really successfully helped us think about how we might move beyond accepting those used futures or those cultural patterns or those affordances, working out deliberately and critically what we want, but also making those assumptions explicit so we can unpick them, and so that we can imagine different systems, we can imagine different ways of being, we can move to that preposterous edge to challenge and create space for things that make us feel uncomfortable, that we have flexibility to imagine, to create, to shift power structures and imagine something different, to shift time scales, to move things in from the core to the edge, to really mix things up, because if we're accepting what we currently see as the probable future, that's not sustainable for us civilizationally. We need to do better, we need to imagine better, we need to create better. Can you please join me in thanking our panel? Thank you. Thank you.